welcome back to Suited Up, a show where we take the measure of the inseam of game mechanics. We'll bring up their uses, their history, and their hems. On this episode of Suited Up, working title, we're going to be looking at playing cards. This is definitely part one of a larger subsection of the show, where we will dig into all sorts of different card games, loads of other interesting cards and card mechanics, but today we will just be looking at playing cards. They're expecting me to put cards in my mouth, but I won't. Not this time. Transition. So what are playing cards? Let's break it down. Ooh, that's nice. Just get rid of the jokers. Playing cards are specially treated rectangles of paper, generally small enough to fit into the palm of the average person's hand. Average person's hand for scale. Each card has two sides, a back and a face. The back is generally consistent across a whole deck of cards. The face of a playing card contains a suit, which is a fancy name for one of these little symbols, and a value, which is either a number from 2 to 9, or one of these well-dressed folks. How playing cards work and what they simulate is an incredibly difficult question with about 1 million different right answers, because, like dice, which we talked about in another video, cards represent incredibly abstract arrays of probabilities, with which a game can do whatever it desires. Although the possible outcomes on a deck of cards are more and more varied than the roll of the dice. 2. Jack of diamonds. The four most common things people do with cards are shuffling, dealing, drawing, and playing. 3 of diamonds. I'm not going to put them in my mouth. So where do playing cards come from? Playing cards originated in 9th century China during the Tang Dynasty, where they were popularized thanks to the invention of woodblock printing press methods, which enabled people to press cards using wood blocks. Although they looked very different to what we're familiar with now, they were similarly used for recreation. These cards didn't have suits or values on them, but it's thought instead that they had short instructions of things that were to be done upon drawing the card, much like some games we still have today. That bird's driving me nuts. It's that same... Those original forms of cards spread across the Eastern world in the bags of traders and soldiers, making their way through India and Persia, and then eventually to Europe through the Mamluk dynasty in medieval Egypt. During this time, the cards were changed and further developed until they much more resemble something that we are familiar with today. Initially, there were many different types of decks with different suits and values on each of their cards. There are far too many to go into right now, but here's a little section I like to call Josh's 2 favourite decks of cards through history. Now, the German deck, with 32 or 36 different cards, suited as acorns, bells, leaves, and hearts. The German suited decks were removed from popularity during the 30-Year War from 1618 to 1648, when French troops were deployed into what's now Germany, brought with them French suited decks. The Spanish deck, which had 40 or 48 cards, suited bastos, oros, espados, and copas, or clubs, golds, cups, and swords. These Spanish cards featured much more elaborate designs, which required more colours and more refined printing methods, whereas the French suited cards were more standardised and generally just used black, red, and blue on white. This allowed them to be produced far more cheaply and quickly in comparison, and thus became far more popular than the Spanish cards. The suits we have today come from simplifying much more abstract designs, for example, diamonds from roof tiles and spades from pike heads. These French suited decks are the ones we still use today, and if you look around, you'll probably notice that most of them are still printed with those same colours, the reds, the blues, and the blacks. Stop telling me to put them in my mouth! How do cards feel? There are some cards that don't feel good to use. If they're too plasticky or floppy, they can become difficult to manoeuvre. But most cards nowadays are finished with what we call air cushioned or linen finish, which makes them really nice to toss about. They slip and they slide in a very controllable manner. They're just really nice. Having such a widespread way of matching different cards, by suit or by number, or even a run of cards, means that there's so much flexibility in how you use these cards. And Toby is going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Blackjack is a game all about probabilities, where you play against the dealer. It's got one of the lowest house advantages in all common casino games, but it requires perfect play to get there. For example, memorising this entire grid. If that's too tricky for you, then that's already hard enough for most of us. But if you want to take it that extra step, you can do a little bit of card counting by keeping track of how many high and low cards have come up throughout the deck so far, so that you can maximise your chance of winning and tip those odds just a little bit into your favour. Tip the odds in your favour!
There are so many different ways to organise a deck that if you drop it, it will probably never go back in the same order ever again.
The main thing I don't like about cards is how easily damaged they can be. And so you have cheaty little players memorising which scratches correspond to which cards and stealing your lunch money.
The problem with cards is they've still got that little vestigial bit of theming left to them. Stash. Unlike dice, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, they don't just fade into the background. You roll a dice to represent a big walker smashing into something. You don't notice the dice. I draw a queen to represent the walker smashing into something. Breaks the immersion just a little bit. To do it, you'd have to reskin the cards, which it's not impossible, but it's annoying. Maybe in a couple of 100 years, they'll be so ubiquitous in games that we won't notice them. They'll fade into the background the same way dice do. But right now, not quite there.
There are so many different types of card games, from trading card games to drafting card games to collecting card games to trick-taking card games to fishing card games to comparing card games like trumps or poker. Matt is going to tell us about his favourite game that just uses a standard deck of cards.
My favourite game with cards is Warhammer 40,000. What do you mean a real card game? It's got my favourite card game is poker. Quite like Texas Hold'em, quite like the other varieties too. I'm equally bad at all of them. The reason I like poker is it's got a lot of the things about cards I like. You've got the different probabilities going on. You've got the fact that you can build this very abstract game that lets you interact with other people. You've got loads of different strategies and sub-layers going on. Now, I've never played for money. I don't recommend that you play for money. I play because I find it fun. The reason I don't play for money is because I'm terrible and I can't read people. I like the mechanics. I like the sub-layers. I like the fact that you're basing probabilities and working them out. You're trying to work out what your opponent is and you're bluffing. But I think the real reason I really like it is because deep down, I want to be James Bond, like almost everyone. And poker gets me there.
Oh, they're jokers. I can't use. One of my favourite card games is Racing Demons, where you split a deck in half and make 5 face-up piles. You then start a manic race against your opponent to try and stack consecutive... I need some good cards to actually make this a possibility. There's no turns and it quickly devolves into chaos, but you keep going until one of you runs out of cards. You then reset the stacks and go all over again until one of the stacks is completely empty. Whoever runs out of cards first wins.
Didn't you hear me say poker, Mr. Bond? I don't know much more about James Bond than that.
Right, let's work this out. Okay. The thing about cards is they represent an unrealised probability. Loads of other random number generation techniques, such as dice, are entirely based on deciding the result at the point of execution. This card, sitting on this table, its result's already there. Until it's flipped over, it could be any of the ace to the king, but it already is one of them. It's kind of Schrodinger's cat. The cat really is dead or alive, but until you flip it, it could be both, and so you have to think of it as any option. I don't have hands. My opponent, sitting across from me, might have a very large hand. They know what's in their hand, and from that they can work out what the probability of this card is. They play, and they use the knowledge given to them by their hand to make inferences about what cards on the field might be, what cards might be in an opponent's hand. This partial knowledge, this working out what a result might be, is somewhat unique to cards in their probability generation. And this is why they lend themselves so well to hidden knowledge mechanics. You know what this card is, I don't. If I'm relying on it being a king and it turns out to be the ace, then I'm ruined. Because of the multiple limited sets within them, there are 4 of each type, but there are also 13 of each suit. You can keep track of what's been played in a very different way to if it was just the numbers 1 to 52. And this too can be used to set up all sorts of different mechanics to play off. Do you need to collect all of one suit? But that one's already been played. It really gets people into the mindset of working out what's on the field, which is ironic given that most places try and ban card counting.
Fun fact, the US military have repeatedly used playing cards to help their soldiers recognise the faces of their enemy leaders by printing them on custom playing cards.
There was one trick that happened to my friend, right, where he picked a card, the magician didn't look at it, he put it back in the deck, shuffled it up, gave it a few cuts, and then he couldn't find the card. Trick over. A week later, my friend went in for a routine appendicitis. Halfway through the operation, the doctor took off his mask, it was the magician, and he reached down into my friend's body, pulled out a crumpled bit of paper, all bloody, and said, "Is this your card?"
I think we'll keep seeing cards pop up in games, although now that it's easier than ever before to create your own cards, I think the playing card deck is going to decline somewhat in popularity over people having more flexibility and control over what they want to show on the cards. Another game that we've been working on that uses a standard deck of cards is Letters from a Fallen Empire, a solo RPG where you play as a soldier sent off to fight and probably die in some grand war that is not of your making. You draw cards to determine what happens to you in a given time and then write letters to your loved ones, updating them and letting them know that you're okay, until one day the letters just stop coming. You can find a PDF with playtest rules for Letters from a Fallen Empire on our website. There's a link below. Go give it a try. It's really interesting. Thank you for tuning in for another episode where we talk about game mechanics. Next time on Suited Up, we're going to be looking at trading mechanics in games. So stick around, like and subscribe, and you'll get a notification maybe when that goes up. Now, I know what you're really here for. I know why you've stuck around this long for this.